Good afternoon, everyone. How is everyone doing today? Welcome to this webinar where we'll try and build a small application using React. As you're aware, the objective of this webinar is going to be building an MVP of a Netflix style single page application using React. We'll be focusing on the front end. We'll not be focusing on the back end for this particular case. And we'll be using React as our library of choice for this purpose. Now, React is, before I dive into code and before we actually start building the application itself, let's settle for a few things. First up, why are we using React? So React is a JavaScript library for building user interfaces and web applications. And it's by Facebook. So one of the good things about React is that it follows a component-based architecture. Now, what that means is that you have a user interface in front of you. How do you actually implement that in code? What React allows you to do is to break down that user interface into manageable features. Each feature is called as a component, and a component can encompass all the necessary UI elements, all the data, all the logic that is necessary for that feature to function. So essentially what you're doing is you're building reusable parts of the user interface which come together, and that's how you get the final application in place. Another important aspect of React is that you work in a declarative fashion. Now, declarative here means that your user interface is driven by data. Changes to the user interface, whatever you see on the UI, any change that happens is driven by data. So essentially, you focus on the data, and React manages the user interface updates, or as we call it, DOM updates for you, right? So that's where React really shines. You build your application in such a way that data is your source of truth. Now that data can come from the user, that data can come from an API, a service at the back end. It, it just depends on what you're building. But essentially, you are building declarative UIs and declarative applications. React also uses something called JSX. JSX is a syntax. It's a subset of XML. In simple words, what that allows you to do is it allows you to express the UI elements, whatever buttons, tables, or divs, or images, anything that you're building. It allows you to express all that in an HTML-like syntax. Okay, so it's not technically HTML. It looks like HTML, which is why web developers, designers find it very familiar to work with. So when you're transitioning into React, when you're learning React, this is one of the good things that happens, that the way you express the user interface, you design the elements, it looks quite familiar if you already know HTML, right? So you're essentially leveraging your knowledge of web design when you're building these web applications and UIs. Another feature that React provides is virtual DOM. Now, without getting into too much of complexity, it's suffice to say that virtual DOM is built for performance. This is the heart of React, and this ultimately enables you to implement optimal updates to your page. So your applications work fast, they update they update promptly whenever data changes, they quickly update, and overall you get a performance boost in your applications, which is very, very good when you're working with, when you're building, let's say, dashboards which have to show rapid updates to the user interface all the time as data comes through. Imagine a stock market dashboard where you have figures which keep updating in real time. So that kind of a thing is what React is really good at. It's easy to learn comparatively when compared to other frameworks. I'd say that React is comparatively easier to learn because it ultimately leverages your knowledge of JavaScript. So you're not learning a drastically different syntax. You're not learning anything which is out of this world, or you do not have to learn a new language per se. You can leverage your existing knowledge of JavaScript and create React applications, which is great. And finally, what we have is a battle-tested library, because Facebook, not only Facebook obviously uses React for their applications, but other than Facebook, a huge number of enterprise and startups all over the world are using React today, and React is growing, by the second. So it's the library of choice. It's the go-to library at this point in time, and that's why we're using it for building our MVP. Now, coming back to the project, what we are building today is going to be essentially a minimum viable product which has just the core features that you see on an application like Netflix or Prime Video or HBO Max or something similar, right? It's a video streaming application. We'll build a login screen. The login screen will be, again, quite simple. It will allow you to type in a username and a password, and this should then log you in to the browser. And the browser is the main interface. This is where everyone lands up when they log in. The user sees various genres of video titles or movie titles listed here. You can see the individual film strips which show the movie titles, and this data again will be fetched from a backend and will be rendered for you on the UI. Another feature which we'll build into the browser will be an infinite scroll. So using the buttons that I hope you can see it. There's a right button here, right scroll button. There's a left scroll button. Using these buttons, you would be able to scroll this film strip left and right in an infinite fashion, so that it doesn't ever reach the end, or at least it gives you that impression that it's a circular list which is scrolling all the time. So we'll build this, and then when someone clicks on the play button here, we'll get to a player. We'll also have a details page which shows the details, the synopsis, and the overview of the title that you're trying to play, along with a small rating widget, and of course the poster and the title. So when you click on the play, this will take you to a player. We'll use a simple HTML5 player for that purpose, and we'll have the video playing on the UI. So this is what we are essentially building in this example. So I can see some questions right away, but we'll answer the questions at the end if that is okay with you all, right? Thank you. Now, as I mentioned earlier, React allows you to break down a user interface, or for that matter, an application, into components. And components allow us to uh, design and develop the application and the interface in a systematic fashion. This also allows you to evolve the component over time. You don't have to uh, affect the rest of the application when you're evolving a specific feature in your application. For instance, let's say you have a rating widget somewhere. A rating widget is what shows us the number of stars for, let's say, a restaurant or a movie or a book title or anything. Let's say you have that feature on in your application. Now, over a period of time, you want to evolve how that looks, how that behaves for the user. You can do that in isolation by focusing only on that component and without affecting the rest of the application. So that's the overall design advantage which solutions like React bring to the table, and that's why modern web applications and even mobile applications are built using such frameworks and libraries, right? So that's one of the great advantages. For our application, for our purpose, what we're going to do is we're going to have this basic layout in place, where right at the top we have the app component, which is think of it as the all encompassing parent. Now the purpose of the app is to sort of enclose over the rest of the application in place, and this is going to be a hierarchy, right? So all components here work in a hierarchical fashion, just like you see here. Right below the application will be something called as a router. Now in when you access a normal website, you have various pages that you go to, right? So let's say you have a standard corporate website. You go to the home page, which is called as the root. Then from there you might have a page called about us, which would be, let's say, your something something.com/about. Then you might have a product catalog, which would be something something.com/catalog, and so on and so forth, right? So in a traditional website, you have various pages that you go to. But when we build an application using a framework or a library like React, what we are essentially doing is we are building a JavaScript application which will render as a single page. It will be just one single HTML page which brings in the entire application into our browser, which is where it then executes and renders and gives us the UI to us. So in such a fashion, what we need to ultimately do is implement a solution which gives the feel of navigating a traditional website, but within the confines of the single page JavaScript application that we have. And for doing that, we require something called as a router. So this again is a package. It's what we're going to use is something called React Router, which is immensely popular in the React ecosystem. It's a third-party product. It's a third-party package which you download, you install, you integrate into your application, into your React application. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to express individual routes. And ultimately, what those routes do is they bring up, they display the components that represent those individual sections, right? So we'll have the router in place from where we'll have a login section or a login page that you will see. This will have a simple form which will allow us to type in a username and a password and a login button. Then we'll have the browser page. The browser page is where you'll see all the film strips and the genres and everything. And the browser page will further use something called genre collection, which will fetch data for all the various genres of movie titles or TV titles that we have in the database and will display for us. And the genre collection component will further display the film strips, right? The film strips which we are talking about. Likewise, the video player. Now, when you try and play a video, the video player will be a separate component, and we'll use another component called fetch video, which will do the job of fetching the URL to the actual video clip to play. So we're going to use we're going to use composition in React. Now, one of the good things about composition is that you can separate the logic easily. So you can say that my player is a separate component completely, and I can design the player the way I want in isolation. And the player is not responsible for the data fetching logic that is required to pull the actual video clip. So that is separately handled by the fetch video component. So by creating this separation, you can handle these two aspects of the components separately, giving you the freedom of handling each, and evolving each in isolation. So that's what we're going to do here. And finally, there'll be a page called details, which will show you the poster image, the synopsis, and the rating and all that. So besides this, there are a couple of other components that we are going to build, which are not seen in this particular chart, but we'll obviously work on that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the API, our, our backend. What will ultimately provide us with the data? So what we have for this example is a Node.js based API, a simple Node.js Express application, which uses a data set from TMDB or the movie database for the purposes of all the TV titles and the genres that you see. So these are the various routes that the backend provides to us. You have a post route which accepts a JSON object with the username and the password, and if that is correct, it just gives you a confirmation. So we'll build a very rudimentary authentication system here. Then there are a couple of get routes. There's a route which gives us a list of TV show genres that we have in the database as a JSON object, as a JSON array. We have a route which gets us the list of movie titles for a given genre ID. Likewise, we have a route which gives us the details of a specific title, a TV show title or a movie title. We have a route which accepts the ID of a video and returns back a URL to a video clip. Now, in this case, we just have a fixed video clip across all the all the pings to this particular URL. So we'll use that. And then we have a static URL called /images, which provides access to all the image posters and the thumbnails that you see ultimately. Router DOM library is part of the React router package, which has to be separately installed. It's not part of React, so it has to be installed. Here I've already configured it, and that's how it's there in place. And what we'll need to do in the application is start by creating the switch component first, like this, and then we can express our routes. So what we'll do here is we'll say if the path is the root, then let's say present the home page or root, whatever. So if you do this at this point, One second. I still have to configure the router. One second. I'll go into the index.js. Sorry, I forgot about this. So what you need to do is at the index, you need to bring in the router itself so that the switch and the route components work. So here, let's bring in something called browser router. Okay, I'm in the index.js file. Again, from the React route DOM. And all that we'll do is we'll take our app and we'll enclose it in an instance of the router. Okay, so once you do this, you should be able to see homepage or the route at the root, right? So this is the root, the home route that we go to. All right. Next, let's create more routes. So for today, what we'll do is we'll also create the login route. Let's do this. And for now, let's just say login page. So if I go here and if I say /login, then this says login page, because now I am able to navigate to an actual route. Although we are still running a single page application, it's a single JavaScript application. But what React Router allows us to do is to monitor the browser's history stack. The history stack is a structure which stores the URLs that you're trying to access. It is able to access that and is able to render that specific component or that specific content based on what route you're trying to access, right? So if I go back to root, it says homepage or root. So this is what we have created. We'll also create one more, which is /browse. Now this browse is going to be where you see the browser, the film strips, the genres, whatever, right? So let's call this as browser. So we have our routes in place now. So let's go to browse, for instance, and you can see the browser, you can see the login, and you should be able to go back to the home page, right? So this is what we have in place. Now let's start creating the login page first. So for that purpose, what we'll do is we'll create a folder here called components, and I'm just using this to store all my components in one place so that it doesn't clutter the rest of the root region that we have over here. Okay, so let's create a new file here called login.js, and when you create components, make sure that the naming strategy uses the first letter as uppercase, like how it is right now, and this is very important to do. So here, let's export default a function called login. Okay, so essentially React components can be just simple JavaScript functions which return UI elements to display. That's in the most fundamental and basic sense is how React works. You export a function which returns back JSX, which represents the UI elements to render on the screen. That's what we get. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is, for example, I can return, and now I can use JSX. So JSX in this case is the HTML-like syntax that I've been using. So let's say this is my login component. Okay, let's just do this for now. And what I can do now is I can go back to my app.js and I can import this file. So we'll say import login from component/login. And instead of this h1, we can just say login like this. Okay, so what we have done is that when someone goes to /login, the React router system will render the login component, and the login component is here. So let's just see if that works. Yeah, so it says this is my login component, right? So now we are able to use this. Now for designing this entire page, what we'll do is we'll create one more component which will act as the sort of overall layout of my application, which will have the logo in place and a couple of other things. So we'll create a component called layout. And the benefit of using this process is that you can design the overall consistent layout of your application separately as a component and design the features separately, so that the same layout can be used across the entire application without recreating the same thing every time, right? So I'm going to create this master layout in a separate file. So let's do this. I'll again export a function called layout, okay, which returns a few things. Now, what is it going to return? The first thing that we'll do is we'll create a set of empty tags. Okay, now these are like, imagine that you have HTML tags, but they're empty. They don't have a specific name or a type attached. Now these are called fragments. And the thing with React is that every component should return only one single element at the root. So you could have a div here, right? You could have a div in place. This can contain anything that you want. However, you also have a special component called fragments, and this is the fragment operator that you see. The benefit of fragments is that it will not render a div on the UI and still allow you to export one single top level element, right? So this is what we use to prevent unwanted divs inside the React UI. So we don't want to clutter anything, because here we'll have multiple things. We'll have first a header section. So I'm just using standard HTML5 header element here, and we'll render an image here. Now I'm going to import the image also. This is going to be the Flixit logo. So you can import images just like how you import standard JavaScript files, components, and style sheets here. We have the Flixit logo. I think it's Flixit-logo.png, right? And then here in the header, let me add a standard image tag with the ID logo, because this will then pick up the styles that I want for this. And for the source, we want to now set the source to the imported image, right? And this can be done by using a pair of curly braces, which is the React way of putting an expression, or let's say using the data from a variable, right? So we'll set up the source like this. We'll also set up an alt which says welcome to Flixit or something similar, and yeah, close it like this. And we have a layout component being built. Of course, you won't see anything because we are still not using this component anywhere. Now, below the header will be the main section. Now, this is the section where we'll have the login page if you're using, I mean, the login form. If you're on the login page, you'll have the contents of the detail page. If you're on the details route, you'll have the browser if you're on the browse route. So this is where all the content will go. So how do you put external content inside a React file, inside a React component? Well, in this case, what we'll do is we'll use something called props. Now think of props as inlets to your component. So you design a component. Now the component has to use data from the outside world. How does it do that? Well, it does that using something called props. So think of them as inlets, which you can use to put data inside a component so that it can be consumed. In this particular case, I'm using a special type of prop called children, and you'll just see why we are doing this in just a second. So in the section, when we bring this in, I'm just going to render whatever comes using the children prop. Okay, you'll see this in just a second what it does. And then we have the footer section. So footer is going to be simple. Here I'm going to use one of the React icons. Okay, so import. Now this is a package called React Icons. You can look up on the internet, and it has a catalog of pre-built vector icons or image icons that you can use as React components. So I'll just put a copyright symbol here, which is like this. So this is not something that you need to remember or anything. There's a catalog available on the React Icons website, which you can refer to, and you can then import the specific component from there. Once you import, all you have to do is just put it here. So we'll say like this, and I'll say copyright knowledge heart all rights reserved, right? Something like this, anything will do. So we have a base layout in place where you have a logo at the top, and there is something called children, which you currently won't have any idea about, but we'll see this in just a second. And then we have a copyright symbol and the words knowledge hut and everything right in the footer. So how do we use this now, right? So using this is going to be quite easy. The first thing I'll do is go into the login component. And in the login component, we'll start by importing our layout. So let's import the layout. And once I have the layout in place, I'll get rid of this. This is no longer required. And we'll render the layout, right? We'll render the layout first. And let's just refresh this, and you'll see the logo in place. You'll see the copyright. There's nothing here, right? There's nothing here because that should go inside the opening and closing layout tags. So now your layout acts like a container. Think of it as a box, which will always give you the Flexset logo. It'll give you the footer, and this area in the middle called section is left for you to add content. So if I go here and if I say this is my login page, if I save this, you'll see that this is my login page comes inside that area which has been demarcated for it called section. So this way you can create containers, layout containers, right? So these are think of them as compositional containers. So you create this master container, do whatever you want. You can have your navigation in place. We'll create that in just a second, and then use that container for rendering anything that you want, right? So that's how easy it gets. So let's continue working on the layout a little bit. I'm going to create two things which will go inside here, inside the header actually. One is the nav bar. Now we don't have a purpose for the nav bar. I'm just going to put it in place just as a proof of concept to show that you can have your navigation sections up here, right? So we'll stay on the login page. I'm just going to squeeze this browser in, and let's create another component called navbar. Now imagine in an actual application, in a production application, this would be where you show all the links to your various sections within the application, right? So in something like Netflix, this could point to the top 10 movies, or my list, or what's new, those kind of things. So once again, we'll export default function called navbar. Notice how the name of the functions they start with an uppercase. That's a necessary convention in React, right? Just like the file names have to start with an uppercase first character, likewise the names of the functions that you export as a component need to be with uppercase, right? So I'll do this, and we'll basically create a nav section. So I'm using standard HTML5 tags here. I need to create a hyperlink. Now, when you're using React Router, you should not use your standard standard HTML anchor tags. Instead of that, the React Router provides you with a link component. So you'll notice in React, everything is a component. You essentially create components, you import components, you compose together components, and that's how you build your entire application, right? So I import this in, and we can now use this. So this component basically will create, let's create a link to the root or the home page, and we'll call this home, right? So we have exported a nav. I'm not going to put anything else. You can put any number of links that you want, but this being a proof of concept, we'll have just one single hyperlink here. You can add multiple, maybe something like top 10, my list, etc., and they can all navigate to their own specific routes. Those specific routes can then be described here, and those components can be loaded in with all the functionality in place. So I just have this one single thing, and I'm going to make this as part of my my layout so that it's available on all the pages, right? So let's import navbar like this, and the navbar just goes here right below the image like this, and you should see the home button, right? So this is the home. If I click on this, I go to the home page, and if I go back to the login, I can now see this UI coming to life slowly and gradually, right? Hope everything is fine till now. Next, we'll build another component called profile, and profile will require a few more extra things, but we'll just flesh out the basic and we'll come back later. So profile, let's build this. For default function profile, and we'll export, we'll create a div where the class name is set to profile. Now, if you watch closely, you'll notice that in HTML we use class as the attribute name, right? But in the case of React, we cannot use the word class for the simple reason that this is JavaScript. We are not in HTML land, and this is not HTML. This is JSX. In JSX, there are certain conventions that you have to follow. One of the conventions is that you cannot use certain keywords which are reserved, and class happens to be a reserved keyword in JavaScript, which is why I have to use class name using this camel case convention, right? So this is important to understand. Now, what we'll do here is we'll render the name. So let's say for now, Joe Mockery as some name or something like that. And along with this, we'll also render a button. And this button will be logout btn, and this will say logout. So let's just create a dummy thing like this for now, and we'll bring it into a layout. Profile, and let's see if this works. Yeah. So you can see that we have this thing here which says Joe Mockery, and this shows a logout button, which currently won't do anything because we have not equipped any of our components to do anything specific. So this is just the layout that we have created. So now with this in place, and we'll come back to the profile because this should only be shown when we are logged in. So we'll build the logic in a while. For now, the next immediate step to do is to build the rest of my login page, right? So we built the layout. Let's just close this out, and the profile and the nav bar, these are not required. We'll go back, we'll shift our attention to the login page where we need a form and we need a couple of other things to get this working. So let's get rid of this. Now let's create a div here with the class name set to login-panel. And what this will do is this will create a container where my form is going to appear. Inside this, you create an h1 which says sign in or login or whatever you want. Okay, you'll start to see this being fleshed out slowly and gradually. Then I want input elements, and the first one is going to have placeholder as email or phone number, or let's just call it as username, right? Just to keep things very, very simple. And start getting this. I'm assuming that all of you know what I'm building in terms of the HTML elements that I'm using here. These are standard HTML elements. Your input element, for example, this one is going to be a password. Placeholder is going to be password. Okay, so we get this. Along with this, we also need a button which says sign in, which happens to look like this. So the reason why you see all of this come to life automatically is because the CSS for this is already built in, so you don't have to worry about that, right? Okay. Finally, what I'm going to do is put outside this div, I'm going to put an image. Now let me import that image. This image is the background for this page, which is again available here, called flixit_bg.jpeg, right? So all I have to do is say image, class name for this is login-bg. So you don't have to worry about class names. because this is again part of our style sheet, and it's already built in. This has nothing to do with React as is. And this will give us a complete layout like this. So now we have our login page in place, right? So if I go back to the root, I have this, but if I go to the login page, I have something like this, right? All right. So with this in place, I think the next thing that I can do is start to create a mechanism which will allow us to implement a login process wherein I want to store the user. So once the user is authenticated, you want to store the name of the user somewhere so that it is available across the entire hierarchy of your application, because React follows what is known as a unidirectional or one-way data flow architecture. One-way data flow, think of one-way data flow as a waterfall. Your app component is the root, is the parent, topmost parent. Your data can start from there, and it can cascade down all the components in the hierarchy and be available. Now there are two ways to do that. One is you could use a series of props. Props means, as I mentioned earlier, a prop is it's like an inlet to a component. So you can start from the app component. You can then pass data to individual components. They can pass data to their child components, and you could create that kind of an architecture. However, there is a better strategy which React provides, which is called as the context API, or the context provider and consumer architecture. So think of it as a separate pipeline which you can create, which is only used for passing data across your application. So we're going to use that in this purpose, right? So this will become a little complicated, but just try and follow along, and I'll explain what that ultimately is and how it works. So now React also provides us with something called as the hooks API. So think of hooks as optional opt-in features which you can use anytime. So I have a basic application. If I want to use any React specific features, I can opt in anytime. I can bring those features in and I can use them anytime. So that is what we're going to use here in place of other standard solutions like Redux or something like that, right? We're not going to go in that direction. I'm going to create my own hook, my own service, which will do the job of maintaining the details of the logged in user, and that data will then be made available across my entire application, right? So we'll do that. So let's create a folder called services, and inside services I'm going to create my own hook, and that hook file is going to be known as, once again, I'll call this as, let's say, use global state.js. Okay, so we'll call this use global state, and the intention of making this is so that I can opt into the global data, the details of the logged in user at any point of time across any part of my application. I don't want that specifically everywhere, but I can pull in that data wherever I need, and that's what we're going to do here. So this is going to get a little React specific, but once I build this, I'll try and explain what we are doing. So for this purpose, I'm going to use the React hooks API. Now these are a set of functions that we get built into React, which allow us to create opt-in functions, and by using this you can create your own custom features as well. So what we're doing here is we are actually creating a custom feature. So I'm going to start by exporting a function. So again, everything in React is a component, is like a component. So even a hook will have the same signature of a function being exported, though this is not a component per se. So use global state is what I'm going to use. Again, notice the naming strategy is slightly different here. I don't have the uppercase because this is not a component, this is a hook function, right? And what we're going to do is import two things. The first is called use reducer, which is a built-in hook, built-in feature, and the other is called create context. And this I'm importing from the React core React library. So one of the concepts in React is the concept of state. State is, in simple words, state is the data that drives the user interface. So what you see on the user interface is part of state, and as state changes, React automatically updates the UI in the browser, right? So React takes responsibility of looking at your data, keeping an eye on that data, and whenever that data changes, it implements certain actions that you have programmed in place. That's essentially what state is all about. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to create a global state, a master state. We won't have anything specific stored here, just the name of the user, but you could use this for storing any number of things that you want. So let's create a simple object. Let's call it initial state. And here I'll have one property, which is user. I'm going to set it by default to null, right? So this is your standard JavaScript object. You'll notice that much of what I'm doing here is standard JavaScript. We are creating functions, we are creating objects, we are importing modules. We are not doing anything which looks like an alien world language or syntax. Pretty much what you do in JavaScript. And this is one of the great things about React. It leverages your knowledge of JavaScript, core knowledge of JavaScript. Okay, you're not required to learn a very unique syntax here. All right. Now here is our state, right, which has user set to null. Now we will manipulate this state based on certain actions. For example, when the user tries to log in, we'll manipulate this. And when this changes, we'll cause certain changes to our user interface. That's why we have this in place. Next, I'm going to create something called context, a global state context. Okay, this is done like so. So now, what is context? Context is like a tank, a bucket which carries my state and makes it available using the pipeline that we are going to set up across the entire application, right? So think of the context as a sort of a bucket, a tank which will hold the data in place and will let us pass that across the entire hierarchy of my components as I want. So that's my context. So we have just created an empty bucket in place. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create something called as a reducer. Now, what a reducer is, think of it as your assistant which does a certain action when you give it a command, right? So if I say login, it will take some data from you and it will perform an action. When you say logout, it will again do a certain action for you. So likewise, we can create a reducer and define the various things that it should do. So let's create a reducer. Now, if you are a React user already, this will seem familiar if you've used Redux. So Redux is it's a React ecosystem product. It's a package which is available, which implements a global state container, which allows you to store state in such a way that it is available across your entire application, and you keep it as a master store, and you can modify that from across your application and see the changes across the application as well. But we don't need to create all that with the hooks API in place. So I'm going to create this reducer. You'll see how this helps in just a moment. Okay. So let me just create this first. You can see that a reducer takes state and action. State is what we have here, is going to take this and is going to manipulate this based on an action that we pass into this function. It's a standard JavaScript function, nothing special about it. I'm going to use a standard switch statement, which is going to look for action.type. So action is going to be an object, as you can imagine, and type is going to be a property in that object. Now, when the value of the type property is login, what should happen is it should return back the state as is. Now, the state could have anything more than the user also. So I'm just using the spread notation here, and it should set the user to action.user, right? So what we are saying here is that when this reducer is called with the existing state, whatever that may be, like in this case is the initial state, and when the action is an object where the type property is set to login, take the user property from this action object and apply it to the state. So basically modify the state. That's what we're saying here. In a similar fashion, okay, what we can do is So this is done. I'll also create a case where I have logout. So in this case, we'll return the state. And if you log out, you basically want to set the user back to null. Right? This is what we'll do. Set the user to null. And finally, we'll have, let's say, we'll have a default condition also. So default is nothing but they say throw new error. So if anything other than this comes by, we'll just throw an error. So now that I have a reducer in place, the next thing I need to do is create the custom hook that I want. So here, let's bring in state and dispatch. So let me just create this, then I'll explain what I'm doing. State. So what I've done is I've used the built-in use reducer hook to connect together this function, which will modify my state with an initial state, the basic state that we have. This is what we created in the beginning. So it's going to take this object, consider it as the state, consider it as the data that drives the UI, and is going to modify it based on the actions that we provide using the reducer. So this is what we have set up. Now to set up the pipeline, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have this return back something called as a state provider. Now when this comes into action, you'll understand why I'm doing this, right? So right now this might become a little difficult to understand, but just bear with me. So here I am exporting a component which takes children. Remember we used children earlier when we were creating the layout component. So essentially now when you use global state, it's going to give you a state provider component. So we can just define a component as a function, as simple as that. And this component allows you to compose over anything that you provide. And what it does is it implements the global state context dot provider. So now what is the provider? The provider is the tank which stores all the data, in our case the state, and it gives you the functions to modify that state also, right? And the way we do that is we take this container and we fill this in with state comma dispatch. Dispatch is a special function which allows us to execute the actions that we have configured in the reducer. So once I have this, all I need to do is render the children inside. So here is a component. Let me just expand this a little. Here is a component that we have created. Okay, it's a proper React component. And what that does is it equips anything that you enclose within, just like the layout component, and it equips it with two things: access to the state, which is this object right here, and access to something called dispatch, which will allow you to execute actions. Now, what are the actions? Login, logout. So using dispatch is a function. So it uses this function to execute actions, and those actions can be used to log in or log out, right? So this is what we're doing as a reusable component. And access to the pipeline that we are creating, the context, let's provide that as well. So that's basically the global state context. So this is a custom hook that we have just created, and this will allow us to basically pass data across the application. Now in order to do that, what we'll first do is let's just go into our app.js, because this is the root. We want to connect our pipeline at this point, and in order to do that, I'm going to import the use global state services use global state like this. And in this component, we're going to say, let's get the state provider component that we created like this. Okay. And once we get this, we'll basically take this entire application that we have built and enclose it inside the state provider. So what you're doing is the pipeline that you created, the entire network that you created, you've basically connected that hose from the context into your entire application. So your any component that is downstream, such as the login component or the layout or whatever, can now access this global state, right? So that's what we have done at this point in time. So next thing we'll do is we'll go back to the login page, and let's make this functional. By the way, we are getting this error because of the missing alt tag. Okay, so we require this in place. Okay, now the next thing that I should do is query the API, let the user pass in username and password, query the API, and if that is correct, then redirect the user to the home page. Okay, and that home page could then redirect further to the browser or wherever you want. So currently, let's make this login system functional. Now, in order to do that, whenever the user clicks on the sign in button, it should take the username and password, and it should place a post HTTP request to our backend server, which is running in the background. And if that backend returns back a response, which it will return back with the name of the user. If that happens, then our user is logged in, and we should then store that user in our global state that we have created here, and then we should redirect the user to the home route. Okay, so these are the set of actions that we want to do. To make this happen, let's import a few things in place first. So I'm going to import a hook called useState and useContext. And this is again part of React, part of the core React library. I'll also import our useGlobalState, which we just created, like this. Okay, and the first thing we'll do is we'll create our state variables. So we'll say const username, set username. Now remember when I said state is the data that drives the UI. So essentially what you're creating is you are creating a container which will store whatever the user types in the username field. This is what I'm doing here, right? And the way this will work is that we'll go to the input field here, and we'll say that whenever it changes. So in JavaScript, you have the concept of event listeners. In React, you have something called synthetic events. And the synthetic event system basically normalizes how events work across all browsers, right? So we have the system here, and we'll set it to a function called, let's call this as set username handler. And this is a function that I can create here. Right? So this is set username handler, which takes in an event. So this will seem familiar if you've ever worked with add event listener, right? It does the same thing. And what it does is it uses the set username function to basically pass an event.target.value. So whenever the user types in something here, this function takes that text, whatever the user is typing in, and it basically stores it in a variable in the state, right? This is all it does. It does that using a special setter function, which is the set username function, which we get from the useState hook. So I've optionally brought in a state variable here. This is what we've done. Likewise, let's create one for password. And let's say set password. And we will basically create the same thing for set password handler, set password and target value, and we'll go here and we'll say whenever that changes, whenever the user is typing in, run this function, right? So this is going to update. And one more thing that we'll do is we'll take this data, whatever is being stored in the state, we'll put it back in the input. So this way we create something called as controlled components. And the benefit of controlled components being that your React application's internal state, or how it manages data, is always in sync with the input fields that you have here, right? So this way you create a sort of a circle. So it goes from here into the state and comes back here. So this way, both these things stay in sync. So we've created a controlled component here, or a controlled field rather in this case. Next, I need a way to perform the login. So let's create a function which does the login whenever the user clicks on the button here. So first of all, when the user clicks the button, run the do login function. That's how you basically assign an event handler in React. On click is your click event handler. Notice that this is similar to how events are handled in HTML, with the small exception that in HTML this is all lowercase. Here it's camel cased, right? So this is where React's synthetic event system says that whichever browser you're using, it could be Edge, it could be your Google Chrome, it could be whatever, it normalizes a UI. You don't have to worry about how your browser handles events. You can just type in on click, React will automatically manage everything for you. And it will run this function called do login. So in this do login, now I need to send the data to the backend and see. So I can send the data to the backend very easily. I can send using the standard fetch API, which is built into all modern browsers. Some of you may be using things like Axios or some other third-party library for sending and receiving data from the backend or the API service. You don't need to do that now. Fetch is built into almost every browser, so it's perfectly doable. It's perfectly usable. So I'm going to use fetch, and we're going to send the data back to /API/login. That's my route which handles the login. And what am I going to send? So I'm going to send an object where the method is set to post. We're going to make a post request. When you're sending data, always use post. Then for the body, we'll stringify an object which has our username and password. So whatever the user has typed in, the username and password is going to be turned into a string object and will be sent to our backend. And we'll send this with the content type header as application/JSON. So this is required so that your backend server reads that object as that string as a valid object, okay, so that it can extract data and process. So we'll do this, and once this fetch runs, this returns a promise. So a promise is basically a promise to provide you with data. If that promise is successful, that is, if our backend server responds, that response, whatever we get, we're going to convert that into JSON. And once we have done that, we'll bring this data in. And this is where you need to do a couple of things. You need to clear the form fields. You need to store the user name, which we get from the API, into the global state, and redirect the user to the root route. Okay, these are the three things that I need to do here. Okay, and the way we do that is simple. So first we'll check if you do have user coming in from the API, from the server at the backend. If that is the case, then simply set username to blank. And what this will do is, what is set username? Set username is the state. Now, since we have a controlled component, when you set the state manually, it will clear out your form field as well, right? So this is the easiest way to make this happen. Set password is cleared out as well. And now I want to store the username into the global state. So a few things that I'll need to do first. Let's get access to state context. Remember, this is the pipeline that we created. And to get hold of that pipeline, you have to use a hook called use context, which we brought in earlier. And we will get state context in place. Okay, but where do we get the state context from? Sorry, tiny mistake here. This has to be use global state. You'll have to run this to get the state context. This state context is the pipeline that we created here and we exported out. See this thing. So we are accessing that from the use global state function, which we created. Then I'm going to get the dispatch function from this context. So use context and we say state context. So this dispatch is what we provided using the provider. See, dispatch is a function. So we provide this here, we bring this in, and all we have to do is that if the user is successfully logged in, dispatch an object where the type is set to login, and we'll set user to res.user. Res.user is the user that comes, the data that comes from our server at the back, right? So if that data is there, then we'll dispatch an action. This is called as an action, which is simply an object, and that action is contains two things. There's a type which sets the type as login, and we are providing some payload data, which is basically the username. So what will happen is our use global state will run the reducer. It will see that the action type is login. It will take the initial state that is stored here, where the user is set to null, and it will set the user to the name of the user that comes from the backend, and it will make that available to all the components that are there in this pipeline, right? So that's what we're doing. So after this, all you have to do is redirect the user to something else. So in this case, redirection can happen using the React router. Now for that purpose, I'm going to bring in from the React router something called use history, which is a hook. So this is part of React router. This is not something that I've created. And you can access the history of the browser, which is what we can manipulate using this particular hook. So all you have to do is you have to say that once this is done, history dot push, and let's push it to the root. Okay, so when we are in this UI, if I click on sign in, nothing happens. If I type something here, click on sign in, nothing happens here. But if I type in the username as Joe and flicks it as the password, you can see that now it logs me into the home page, right? So here we have a login system, which is a very rudimentary login system that we have created, as you can see, right? So if you type in anything, it won't work, but only if you type in the right username and password, you'll be able to get that in place. So that's how this part comes up. So this is done. We'll just add one more tiny thing, which is essential. Is you need to put an error handler in place. So I'm not going to do anything specific with the error. We'll just say console.log there was an error, right? So yeah, in fact, this can go out. So what I've done is when the user presses submit and you have any kind of input from the API, whether the user exists or not, you will always get the form to clear out. But if you type in Joe and flicks it, which is the hard-coded username and password for this example, then you are redirected to the root route. So that's how your login system can be made to function. Okay, next up, let's see. Next up, we will create the browse section. So let's see how much we can create today, and we can then resume that tomorrow as well from that point onwards, and we'll again work a little bit with the route protection and a few other things. So let's look at how the browser component can be created. So first up, let's create something called browser.js. As always, creating components. Now React actually gives you two kinds of components. There are what we call class-based components, and there are what we call function-based components. I'm using class-based components here. I'm using function-based components here because they're as simple JavaScript functions. They're extremely easy to work with, and they're extremely flexible because if you require a React specific feature like state, or in this case, you have things like access to the browser history, access to the context, access to other things, you can always opt in. You can bring them in as and when needed. So that's one of the great things about using function-based components. So let's create, as usual, export default function browser. And this guy returns. Now let's bring in once again our layout. So you can see how beneficial this layout is proving out to be, because this gives you a base layout. It gives you the logo, it gives you the profile, it gives you a footer, gives you everything that you want, and then from there you can do anything that you want. Right? So it's pretty straightforward when you bring in the layout. So here's our browser. Now once we have the browser like base created, let's go to the app.js. I'm going to import the browser like this, and instead of the browse thing here, let's just say that this is the browser, right? So I'm on the browse route. I'm not on the home route, mind you. I'm on the browse route. So you can see that the browse, if you go to the browse, we get something like this. Okay, that's what we have. And the same happens in the case of login, but we see the form. So we have a consistent UI across the browser as well now, with the logo and everything in place. Okay, cool. So let's go back to the browser and see what else we have to do here. Now, the browser is responsible for talking to the API, bringing in a list of genres that we have. Right? So we have things like animation, we have history, we have several genres that you can see by going into the server dataset and genre. So you can see here, you have animation, comedy, crime, documentary, drama, family, and so on. So I need to first get a list of these things, because this is what we're going to use for rendering those film strips at the end, right? So this component, the browser, should do that bit at least. And in order to do that, I'm going to import useState, which you've seen recently, and a new hook called useEffect. So you'll see what this does. So first up, let's create a place where we'll store these genres. So it's a useState, and this will be an empty array to begin with. So when the component is created for the first time, something called genres will be set to a blank array. Then let's implement the logic which will query the API. Now, in order to do that, I'm going to use the useEffect hook. So what useEffect does, it allows us to define side effects. Side effects is when you query an API, for instance, right? So in this case, I need to talk to the backend API to get a list of genres. So useEffect allows you to define a function, and it also allows you to define an array of properties which should cause the useEffect to run. So think of useEffect as a function. Every time that this browser function is executed or refreshed or is updated, useEffect will execute, but you can control when this function should run. If you keep it as a blank array, then this will only run once when the component is loaded. Even when the contents of this change, this will not be changed. But you can also pass in a list of dependencies here, which can cause the useEffect to run again. We don't need to do that. We'll keep a blank array, which will ensure that when this component is loaded, that when this page is loaded, when the browser is loaded, we talk to the API only once to bring in the list of genres, right? So make sure that you pass in this empty array when you use useEffect. So again, let's use fetch, standard fetch, API slash genres. This is going to be a standard get request. When we get the data, let's parse the data as JSON. And once we have the data, let's use set genres to the data that we get. Okay, that's as simple as that. And we can also, like, when we do this, you should always make it a point to set up catch, though we are not going to do anything. Error fetch. So this is something which I mean, it's up to you how you want to manage the errors across, right? So we're not going to do anything specific. All right. So with this done, whenever this component loads up, it's actually querying the API. It's fetching in that and storing it in the genres. When that happens, the UI should automatically update. And when the UI updates, it should show you that list of genres. So how do you do that? You basically take your genres and you loop over it using a standard map function. Again, simple JavaScript. And this will give you the genre name, and let's just render h4 tags with the genre for now, nothing too fancy. And another thing that you must do here is configure something called as key. So again, I'm not going to go into too much of detail what this is all about. This requires a pretty lengthy explanation, so let's just suffice that this is essential. A unique string is essential for every instance of the h4 that will render out. So when you do this, okay, I think there is an error somewhere. Let's see what that is. All right. So the error is that we are trying to loop over something that does not exist. So I'm going to create a simple variable called isLoading and set it to true, right? And over here, we'll do conditional rendering. Now, what conditional rendering says, when this component is loaded, isLoading will be set to true by default. But we want to set that to false when our data is fetched in, because your data is being called in an asynchronous operation using the fetch. So it is possible that it takes a little while to query the API. Until we have the data, we should not be rendering the UI, and that is what we're doing here. We're saying that only when isLoading is set to false, only then you should render the UI in place. If that is not the case, nothing will render in place, right? So this is what we're doing. Now, how do you set this to false? You can do that here. So when your data actually comes in, while you are setting it, you can also set isLoading to false, right? So hopefully this should solve the problem. Objects are not valid as React child. Okay, one sec. Let's see what I'm making a mistake here. Okay, let's see what we're fetching actually. We need to figure out what we are fetching from the database. In fact, I'll just create, I don't even need to do all this. I'll create the next component in place, which will consume this data. So it's not something that will be required here. Error fetching data, okay. Second. Okay, let's see if we are setting this right. Getting this. And setting it to genre.id. Okay, this will be an object. Sorry, this will be an object. Let's see what this object is all about. This will be genre.name, right? So let's get genre.name. And we get this. So you can see now. So what I was doing is I was basically trying to output the entire object, which will obviously not function. Our genre data contains name and ID, two properties. So name is what we are accessing, and you can see that we now get a list of our genres here. Of course, we are not going to render them as H4. We're going to create a special component for this purpose, which will do the job for us. But let's just wait for a second and create that separately. So let's create a component called genre collection.js. Okay, let's go into genre collection. So the purpose of browser was just to query, get the list of genre and their unique IDs. The purpose of genre collection is to now take individually those IDs and fetch the film strip, fetch all the titles within that genre, right? For now, for today, I'll just create the base component. I'm not going to do anything specific. We'll continue with this tomorrow, but basically we accept a prop called genre, which takes the object which has the ID and the name, and we will return back a UI where I have a div with the class name of movie-row, within which we'll first render movie category label, and let's render the genre dot name here, right? So what we were doing earlier in the browser component, I'm going to do that here. So let's just do this much, and let's bring it over here. So let's say import genre collection from genre collection here, and instead of rendering this h4, let's call this as genre collection. This guy is not required. Actually, let's make this as a self-closing component like this. This obviously is not required as well. In addition to the key, we will also pass in the entire object that we get. Okay, so we are passing the genre and the key to the genre collection component, and it says does not contain a default export. All right, export. There you go. And you'll see something like this. Okay, it's all huddled together because the genre collection function still requires a couple of things to be created, which we have not done yet. So I'll just do that quickly, and then we can stop for the day, and we'll resume tomorrow with a few things. So let's quickly create a row. Okay, so for the film strip, I need to create a row. Within that row, we'll have one more row which will actually translate. So remember that the film strip that we were talking about, those film strips need to be scrollable. So you can see the basic structure in place now, right? We'll get rid of these hideous scroll bars, but the idea is that you'll get that individual movie cards here, which you can scroll right and left, right? So that's what we are trying to build in this case. And within this, you'll be able to render your movie card component. So movie card is going to be that individual card that ultimately renders the UI. So I think we can stop for now. We have about 25 minutes left. I'll take some questions if you have any, and we'll come back tomorrow and we'll resume this exercise from this point onwards, and we'll complete the rest of the application with the rating component, with the player, and a couple of other things, right? All right. So questions. Okay, there's a question regarding resources. So we'll provide the resources on our YouTube page for this. The recording for this session would be available there. We'll put a link to the resources for day one and then again for day two. Another question is, what is the major difference between the class component and function-based component? So class components was the original way of creating components in React, which was essentially an an ECMAScript class that you create, which has state management built in, right? State management and something called lifecycle methods built into place. Lifecycle methods essentially allow you to plug into the life of a component from start to finish, and it lets you implement your own functionality, so that when a component is loaded, you would want to fetch data. When the component exits or is removed from the UI, then you want to perform some other action like a cleanup. With function components, the advantage is that function components, though it originally started as a presentational component, that is, you would use function components just to display things and nothing much. But now with the hooks API in place, you can create function components which are obviously simple to create and read, and you can opt in features using hooks. So if you want state, you can bring in a state using the use state hook. If you want something which is like life cycle, though technically it's not life cycle, then you have use effect, which you've just seen here, right? So if you want to fetch data, you can use effect. Likewise, any feature can be created as a hook. We created our use global state. We used it in place of, let's say, Redux, and we used it to manage our global state. So likewise, you can create your own hooks. There are built-in hooks also, and function components just make it very easy to opt into these features as and when needed, rather than always being their part of the class. The class also is somewhat, I'll say, it's clunky to manage and keep. And you always have state features even if you don't need them. So it's always better to use functions now going forward, and even React encourages you to use function components now everywhere with hooks in place, right? So prefer using the function component. Another question is, in the initial state inside the hook, how can we set multiple states and how to update them separately? So it's quite simple. So for example, here we have the initial state. You can just add anything that you want here. So for example, let's say my movies. This could be an array. There could be something called is admin. This could be false. You could set as many number of properties, individual properties, as you want. And then when you are creating your actions, just update those properties. So this is, see, what I'm doing from the switch statement and the case is I'm returning the action object, and within the action object, I'm only updating the property that I want to, which is why we have this spread in place, right? So it basically takes this object, overrides anything that I specifically want to set, and then returns it back to the state. So this way you can have as many number of properties as you want. Use reducer is, let's say, conceptually similar to how Redux works, and it feels quite similar as well. But it's a built-in hook, so you don't need to do anything. You don't need to import any third-party packages or anything. For most cases, this will work. Of course, if you obviously need a much more larger solution for managing things, then you have things like XState and Redux and everything, which can be used.